We are moving into the second week of Ruth. Growing up, my family rooted for the Cincinnati Reds. You're sorry, but hey, all my favorite teams won titles when I was younger, and IU was 87, the Reds were 90. It is what it is. I live in the past. Anyway, I'm not old enough to remember the Big Red Machine, but I do remember my favorite players from the Reds during those years. It was Barry Larkin and Chris Sabo and Eric Davis, and I always emulate Eric Davis because he was the center fielder, number 44. Just really strong, really fast. And every time a fly ball would get hit to him, he had this tick that he would do with his glove, and he would just hit his glove. Just hit his glove. The ball's coming, and so I used to do that until the ball came quicker, and then bam, it got me. But anyway, I just loved it. So I would go to Riverfront Stadium back in the 90s, and I can remember walking up, and then you go out, and then you see the field. And there was an absolute just amazing, I was like, oh. It was just one of those moments. I can still remember the sights and the smells and the sounds, and I just absolutely loved it the first time that I saw that field. A couple of weeks ago, I had that same amazement. That was funny. I didn't even know, but Jordan and Carly's wedding yesterday, the minister said, when they walk into the room, you should always go, oh. And I thought, yeah, that just came to mind. Sorry, rabbit trail. But anyway, a couple weeks ago, the eclipse happened. And I had some of this same amazement when the eclipse started and it was just getting darker. Just looking around at how dark it was and how incredible that experience was and how amazing God and all that He created truly is. I was just amazed. It's breathtaking. And sometimes we take it for granted. These are I like to take pictures. I don't do anything with them, but these are a few pictures that I found I just absolutely loved. Just unreal. And then the next one. And then we get to the last one. The last one's my favorite. I don't know where it came from, but whoever did, good job. It's just an amazing thing to see God in creation. Here's the thing. I believe there are too many coincidences in creation. This giant rock tilted at 23.5 degrees with an atmosphere that allows us to breathe, with bodies created that are so fearfully and wonderfully made. I would have to close my eyes today to miss the providence of God. To absolutely just miss it. Psalm 19:1 says, the heavens, we see that, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Ephesians 2:10, it says, for we are God's masterpiece. Look to your neighbor and tell us, I'm God's masterpiece. Now, wait a minute. I said, tell them you are God's masterpiece. Say, I am God's masterpiece. Some of you are like, I'm not a masterpiece. Have you stopped believing that you're a masterpiece? Have you stopped believing and just stopped and allowed yourself to be amazed at what God has created for you? Created in you? We talk about heaven. We can't even imagine what's coming. The best is yet to come. Those around you today and in your life that He has knit together into just this beautiful masterpiece. Last week we talked about problems and how if we allow them to affect us, they were just going to change our perspective and how we view things. Naomi was allowing this bitterness to just creep into her life. And I believe this morning, if we aren't careful, we can allow that same bitterness when problems and issues come to just start creeping into our lives. As a recap, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, moves his family out of Israel into Moab because his family needed food. He ends up dying there. Sons married foreign women. They had no children, and they die after 10 years, leaving Naomi with her 2 daughter-in-laws just in an awful, awful position. Naomi hears about things that are going on back home and starts out, offers an opt-out to Orpah and Ruth. One goes home, Ruth stays, and they head into a new chapter with hope. And that's where we find, starting in verse 22, chapter 1. So Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, and he was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And there's this little phrase that says, as it happened. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. And then there's this next phrase that says, and while she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he says. The Lord bless you. The harvesters replied, we can't miss it. The providence of God. And as it happened, while she was there, going back to verse 22, they arrived in late spring at the beginning of barley harvest. As we're reading through the book of Ruth, have you noticed that there haven't been any giant miracles? No supernatural miracles. But have you also noticed the supernatural providence? I love how Craig Groeschel defines providence. He says this, when God uses natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural plan in your life. Have you seen that? Have you lived it? Have you been in circumstances that threaten to overwhelm you or overtake you and God just shows up? Maybe he didn't show up and part the Red Sea, or he didn't build an ark for you, or wasn't in the burning bush, but your friend just out of the blue decides to give you a call. Maybe you've seen it in the generosity of the kindness of a stranger, in the encouraging words from the family of God, in a scripture or a song at just the right time. As it happened. I hope and trust that you have. I trust that we've seen these moments where God has supplied all of our needs according to his riches and glory. And then when we see him do these things, we turn around and thank him for doing it. Romans 8:28, when understood correctly, can shift our hearts towards trusting in the providential power of God in our lives. We know this. It says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them. And we know this doesn't necessarily mean our good. Sometimes we get it twisted. We think everything is going to work out and I'm going to have A, B, and C, and then D, and then no, sometimes it's like Q, P, X. You get all the tough Scrabble letters. Doesn't work. But here's the thing. Do we turn around and give God the praise when A, B, and C do line up? Because he is working. As it happened, happens for us too. Because he's still moving, he's still working, he's still changing lives, he's still making us new. And so do you have the eyes to see that all of these things will work together for good for those that are called according to his purpose? God notices, he sees, he supplies. Then Boaz takes notice of Ruth in verse 5. And as it happened, while she was there, then Boaz asked his foreman, who is this young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She had been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young woman working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you're thirsty, help yourself to the water that they have drawn from the well. So Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? She asked, I am only a foreigner. Have you been there? When God showed up and supplied your needs? What was your response? What were your thoughts? It was like, finally? I hope not. I hope our heart, when those things happen and God supplies our needs, is like, you're a good God. You are such a good God. God, thank you for giving me what I needed, and maybe sometimes not even what I asked for. God, thank you for supplying my needs and not just my wants, because my wants sometimes go off the rails. God is saying, I know, I see, I'm listening, I know what you need, and I'm preparing you for that. This morning, I want us to understand that seeing God's providence often depends on our position, the position of our hearts that we talked about last week. Often, where we are tested and tried is where God is trying to teach us to trust Him. So where's your heart this morning? Are you chasing after God? Making decisions, which we'll talk more about our plans and living on purpose next week, as Ruth did in this chapter, at the beginning of this chapter. Are you looking for God in the middle of your mess? In the middle of your mess, in the middle of your trial. You're like, I can't see God because I'm in the middle of my... We've all been there, but He's there. Amen? He can be seen, but often it's not until the trial is over that we see the evidence of His hand, and that can be tough. Waiting can be tough. But there are times in the middle of the storms, just as Boaz steps in here and protects Ruth, that God steps in and protects us. Those are the times when we must acknowledge that it isn't luck. It's not chance. It's not some random fact that God's like, okay, over here. This group, yeah. And row 4, seat 7. You get blessings today. Underneath your chair is a $25 gift card to wherever you like.
I was waiting for...
Oh, you're not going to look. Okay. It's not there. I'm kidding. I should have done it, though. I didn't think of it. Wasn't in my notes. But God is prepping us and planning us. Have you been there? You get into this new season where you see God providing, and then you look back and you're like, oh, okay. You did that because of this, and you did this because of that, and you start putting all the pieces together. He's prepping us. At the end of spring break this year, after my goat fiasco, we went to Cincinnati. We went to a Reds game. They won. I'm like, let's sit out in left field. Spencer Steer is going to hit a ball. I didn't say that. I didn't call this, but I was like, this guy from the Reds, I think they're going to hit a home run in my area. That's just a good spot to sit. And so we sat out there and got baked because the sun was just so hot. We're like, was this worth it? And then this happens. So this was the bottom of the 8th. Score was tied. Dude comes up. You don't want to say his name. Doesn't matter. Comes up and hits a 3-run bomb. Okay. See the arrow and the little orange dot over here? That's me. Because I had prepared for this moment. However, they weren't prepared. They hit it too far to the right, about 30-some feet, and this guy gets a home run ball, but I'm in the air. I got my hands up, and I'm like, I knew this was going to happen. Can I tell you something? When God provides for us and we turn around and thank Him, I think He has the same reaction. He's like, you saw it. You know, I love them so much. This is amazing. They can see this, and they can see that, and they can trust me a little bit more. I think God's hands go in the air a lot when we turn around and give Him trust. And understand that even though we aren't getting every single thing that we want, and A, B, and C aren't lining up, He's up there, and He's like, they get it. They see it. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad for this, because that's what He wants for us. He wants us to trust in Him. Even when the storms of life hit, even when the trials come, even when we don't know exactly what to do or where to go, remember this morning that there is nothing, not a war, not a disaster, not a diagnosis, not a decision, not an election, not a recession, not a crisis, not a circumstance that will ever cast a shadow on our God. Amen. Not one of those things. He knows what He's doing. He's preparing you. He's preparing us. And none of those things are going to cast a shadow on Him. He is above those things. He is other and holy, and He's still sitting on the throne, and He loves us, and He sees us, and He sees our problems, and it makes Him upset too, that you've had to go through so much. God isn't up there be like, yeah, it is what it is. It hurts His heart when we are hurting, when we are struggling with depression and it hurts his heart, when we lose a loved one. But tell me, what can separate us from the love of God? Nothing. What can cast a shadow on our God? Nothing. Nothing is so big that it causes God to be surprised or overwhelmed or uncertain, because he is working and moving things for good. Have you ever been searching for an answer or been asked a question about what to do and you had to say, I don't know? I hate saying, I don't know. I am the type of person that lobs a guess at every Jeopardy clue. I don't care. Physics, don't care. Grammar, probably going to miss them all. Oxford comma, right? No, kid. Tom gets it. But anyway, I will pick an answer and I will pick that until it hits. Like Malaysia. No, but because I don't like to say I don't know. I don't want to say I don't know. What do you mean I don't know? That makes me feel weak. I'm going to give you an answer even if it's wrong. But here's the thing. When we position our hearts and our minds in a place of trust to God that is in control and knows the answers, it can literally change our lives, because we can say, you know what? I don't know, but God does. I don't know the answer, but God sure does. I don't know what this season's going to look like, but God does. I don't know how this is going to end, but God does. It changes our lives. We can trust that God hasn't lost track of us, and he's preparing us. God's hand is moving in your life, and I wonder this morning, can you see it? Can you see it? Maybe you need new eyes this morning. Maybe you need to position your heart in a new space. Ruth could have made other choices back in Moab. She could have stayed. Life would have probably been easier for her. Wouldn't have had the struggle, the uncertainty. She could have made other choices when they returned to Israel. But I believe she made these choices with God's help, and we can make these choices that position ourselves and our hearts and our decisions where we need to be. And when he sees us trusting in him, we can see God's heart played out in verse 11. Ruth says, I'm a foreigner. God, she's talking to Boaz here. She says, I'm a foreigner. He says this, yes, I know. But I also know about everything that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. I hope I continue to please you, sir, she replies in verse 13. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers. I believe this morning, as we position our lives in God, as we draw closer to him, allowing him to make us new every single day, not just on Sundays from 9 to 10 and then from 10:15 to whenever, but all the time. This is a 24/7, 365, 366 this year kind of life. We position ourselves, he slowly gets a little bit closer. Because James 4 tells us this. He says, come close to God and he will what? Come closer to you. We come closer, he comes closer. We come closer, he comes closer. We come closer, he comes closer. How close are you drawing to God today? I know we might be sitting in some hard seasons, some hard times. But please, church, do not allow yourselves to pull back and say, I don't know. Draw closer to God. It's tough. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. We've all been there when we've kind of just pulled back and be like, I can't do it. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just going to protect myself. I'm going to go into my shell. I don't know if you're going to provide for me, Lord. And we get a little further away when he wants us to come closer. When we draw near to God, when we believe in him and allow his Spirit to lead us, he comes close to us. And this isn't an accident. It is the providence of God that moves us closer to his heart. But we need to have eyes to see and a heart to sense and an ear to hear all he's doing. So how are your eyes today? How are your ears doing? How's your heart? Do you remember when you came to God with all of your, God, I'm a foreigner. I'm not sure God can love me after I did A, B, C, X, Y, whatever your thing is. Do you know what kind of person I am? I'm just a sinner. I'm just an angry person. I'm just a broken, hurt person. Why would God want to be near to me? Because he wants something better for you. He wants hope. He wants love. He wants freedom from all we're struggling with. You say, God, I'm just so lost and I've just ignored God for so long. Does he care? Yes, he cares. Do you remember the moment that God said to you, yes, I know what you've done, but today you get freedom. Freedom for us was food for Ruth in this chapter. She said she didn't know what she was going to do, where she was going to go. And Boaz steps in and offers her this. He says, yes, I know, but I'm going to supply your needs. So freedom from Ruth, freedom for us from our sins and from this life was food for her. God offered that to us and it changes our lives. So what position are you in today? Are you still trying to figure things out, have problems that seem too big to handle, that maybe just cause you to feel unseen? But you're here today, so I'm guessing that you heard God at some point. Because they didn't go back home until they heard about the good news. There has to be a moment in all of our lives where we put our trust in God and God alone to redeem us. Not in our own abilities, not in our strengths, not in our talents, not in how much money we can make or how nice our house is, all of those things, but God alone. I may not know what is next, but I will trust in God. That should be our call this morning. I'm not sure if God can forgive me, but here I am, God, asking you to redeem my life. And I'm saying this morning, I will trust in God. When my past tries to haunt me, I will trust in God. Ruth knew where she came from. She knew her past, now widowed, and she came as a package with a grumpy and bitter mother-in-law. And she's like, I don't know how this is going to play out. Still, when we position our lives close to God and trust in him, he shows up and starts changing who we are now. From the moment that we ask him, he starts supplying what we need. Verse 8 and 9, Boaz provides Ruth with food, water, and protection. And then in verse 14, he meets her immediate needs. He says this, at mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. So she sat with his harvesters. And Boaz gave her roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted. Famine, loss, pain, struggle. And then that little line, and maybe just a throwaway, she ate all she wanted. And God is a good God who gives us what we need when we need it. Has he supplied your needs lately? And maybe you just forgot. That came from God. It wasn't just by chance that this happened and then that happened and then that happened. He supplies our needs. Are your eyes fixed on God so that you don't miss all that he's doing? Are you trusting God? His evidence is everywhere. I love Acts chapter 14, starting in verse 16. It says, in the past, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways. And then verse 17, but he never left them without evidence of himself and his goodness. Isn't that our testimony today? He's never left me without his evidence of him working and his goodness. For instance, he sends you rain and good crops and gives you food and joyful hearts. Where is the evidence in your life? Where is the goodness in your life? What are the as it happened moments in your life? What are the while you were there moments where you can just see God's providence line thing after thing after thing up? The first church we were at, we decided in 2010 that it was time for us to move on, and we looked and looked and looked and looked and looked and then kept looking. randomly put my resume on a church staffing website, which is crazy because it's all over the place. Well, this church in North Carolina gives me a call. It was a Methodist church. I was a Wesleyan. I'm like, I don't know what to do. They're close. So anyway, I won't go into that today. So we go down there, try out for the job. It's a ton different than how we'd grown up, and they had the situation was, we're like, I don't know, do we fit, do we not? Took the job, moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina in 2010. Realized pretty quickly that our daughter Kate, I've told this story before, that she needed open heart surgery. And Duke Pediatric Cardiac Care is one of the best in the world. And they were an hour from us. At this church that I wouldn't have applied to. I wouldn't have thought, well, I'm going to go to Fayetteville, North Carolina, to this Methodist church 10 hours away from anybody that I knew. Anybody at home. Sarah's mom lived a little closer, but the rest of our family was everywhere. We're like, okay. So we moved there. We realized that she needed this surgery. We get there, and the nurse that we had when she came out of surgery, she was from South Bend, Indiana. Kay was born right up there. This nurse had went to school with someone that Sarah had worked with. This nurse had went to Bethel College here in Indiana. The doctor, wait for this one, the doctor was an IU grad. Yeah. Made me feel a lot better. Purdue has all the vets and the engineers, and we get doctors and stuff. But anyway, but that's a little thing. If it would happen to you, you'd be like, and? For me to see the hand of God in those moments, knowing that we didn't necessarily want to go that far, but God put us there. We didn't necessarily want our daughter to have open heart surgery, but if we were going to have it, this is the place to have it. We're far away from home. We're not sure, okay. Then we find out our nurse and our doctor are both from home. Seeing God's providence in our lives, you know what it does? It causes us to lean in a little closer to it. And I don't want you guys to miss God's providence in your life because it'll keep you from leaning in just a little bit more. So we do that. Kate has her surgery, and then I get an email out of the blue from this Pastor Fletch guy. He didn't know that. I mean, it's a whole thing, but it just you look back, and it should have been a foreshadowing because I remember walking in the office door. I remember that moment, and Rick and I had met before. We weren't strangers, but we weren't super close then. And I walked in that door, and big arm, open arms, give me a giant hug, and I'm like, "That's Lifeway." Like that. That's the heart of this church. And so looking back, it's just like, wow, like, God, how amazing are you in your providence? And it causes me to trust him just a little bit more. I wonder this morning, what have you gone through? What are those moments that you thought, my goodness, this is the worst season in my life? But then you get past it and you see God moving you and growing you and maturing you in the fruits of his Spirit, starting to come up out of the ground in the soil that you thought was just rotten, that you thought was terrible. And God starts changing your life and you become this new person because he's making you new. If we miss it, it causes us just to... I don't know if I can trust this God. He didn't give me what I wanted. But when we see his hand moving, when we see him providing for us, we understand that all along the road, the moments that we've had to trust in him and through the tears and the frustrations and the crying after God to say, I will trust in you. Lord, help my belief. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. In those moments of me drawing close to God, he kept calling me to come closer back to him. To come to the table, to come back home. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with his harvesters. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. Here's the thing, Ruth had sinned against God. Ruth comes empty-handed, and we do too. Every good thing that we have comes from God's goodness. The sooner we understand that, the sooner we'll see it. Boaz blessed Ruth, and God blesses us more than we expect or deserve with grace and mercy and peace today. Boaz invited Ruth to the table just as Jesus invites you and I to the table. Some of you have been stuck in chapter 1, and maybe you've had moments that just changed your life, and you haven't seen God in it yet, but I'm telling you this morning, He is drawing you near. His Spirit is saying, I want you to have an abundant life. It doesn't mean you're going to get all you want, but I'm going to supply your needs. Because we know that if we confess our sins, that He is faithful and just to forgive us and cleanse us from those things. We know that God knows what we need before we even ask Him. But I wonder this morning how often we have kept ourselves from blessings because He wants us to come near. And then He comes near. And He's saying, I know it's a struggle. I know you've had some hard times. I know this season isn't great. I know those things, but I'm going to provide for you. You're going to see my hand, and it might not be until we get to heaven. I'm just going to be real with you. Sometimes we look back and we go through seasons, and they're tough, and there is no why. I've been there. You look back, and there's no why, and you're like, but no, there's just no why. But can we trust God's hand in those moments? That He's still changing us into something new?